Millions tuned in live, thinking they were about to witness history. Instead, they saw a disaster unfold in just 73 seconds. But what if the crew was still alive as they fell? What if NASA had been warned the night before and ignored it? What if part of the shuttle was only just found decades later, lying at the bottom of the ocean? This isn't the story you learned in school. These are the shocking things you didn't know about the Challenger disaster, and once you hear them, you'll never see it the same way again. Let's dive in. The dream before the disaster. How Challenger was born. Challenger wasn't just a rocket, it was a gamble disguised as progress. When it launched into the sky, the world thought it was witnessing another proud milestone for America's space program. But what most people didn't realize was that this mission, like many before it, was built on years of ignored warnings, risky design choices, and political desperation. Challenger didn't fail because of just a rubber seal. It failed because it was the product of a system that made safety optional. So why did NASA push forward with such a fragile design? What was really driving America's space program? And why did the dream of reusable spaceflight begin with so many red flags? After the final Apollo mission returned to Earth, NASA found itself in a weird spot. They had done the unthinkable, put men on the moon, and yet, instead of being showered with endless funding, they were told to scale back. Congress was cutting budgets, and public attention was shifting. The moon landings were spectacular, but now people were asking, what's next? NASA had to answer fast, or risk becoming irrelevant. Their solution? Build a space shuttle that could launch repeatedly, not just once every few years like Apollo, but frequently, up to 24 times a year. It would look and act more like an aircraft than a one-way rocket. It would carry astronauts, satellites, even military payloads into orbit and bring them back safely. The idea was that this would make space travel cheaper, more routine, and more appealing to both the government and the public. NASA called it the Space Transportation System, but everyone else just called it the Space Shuttle. They pitched it as a workhorse for the future, a reusable space truck that could do it all. Behind closed doors, though, there were serious problems. The ambitious design ran headfirst into a harsh reality: money. Congress wasn't about to approve the funding NASA needed to build the safest version of this vehicle. So compromises began. One of the most critical design choices was about the shuttle's two solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. These huge cylindrical rockets were attached to either side of the shuttle's external fuel tank. They provided most of the thrust at liftoff. But here's the catch. The safest option, liquid-fueled boosters, was rejected. Why? Because they were more expensive, more complex, and required more development time. Instead, NASA chose solid rocket boosters made by Morton Thiokol, a private contractor with strong political ties. Solid boosters are cheaper and simpler to store, but they come with a big risk. Once ignited, they can't be shut off. They burn until the fuel is gone. If something goes wrong mid-flight, there's no way to abort. From the moment those boosters light up, the crew is committed. The SRBs were also designed in segments, a decision driven by manufacturing and transport needs. Instead of one seamless rocket, Morton Thiokol built them in pieces, bolted together with joints. These joints were sealed with O-rings, rubber gaskets meant to expand and keep hot gases from leaking out. But this design had a deadly flaw. If the O-rings didn't seal properly, especially in cold weather, superheated gases could escape and burn through the booster casing. Engineers spotted this vulnerability early on. There were warning signs as far back as 1981. But because no shuttle had been lost yet, NASA leadership thought the risks were tolerable. They believed past success meant future safety. That belief would cost lives. During the Cold War, NASA's Shuttle program doubled as a secret military asset. The Department of Defense planned to use it to launch spy satellites and classified payloads, including missions from a polar orbit site in California. NASA was juggling public science, military demands, and congressional scrutiny, all at once. To secure funding, NASA promised up to 24 launches per year, even though each shuttle needed exhaustive inspections and repairs after every flight. Instead of slowing down, NASA sped up. Challenger was never designed for failure, only for show. Its sleek exterior hid fragile systems and dangerous shortcuts, and as launch after launch seemed to go fine, the agency marched forward, blind or unwilling to admit disaster was already built into the machine. New bombshells about the Challenger disaster that will blow your mind. Fast forward to recent years, nearly 4 decades after Challenger broke apart in the sky, and something chilling surfaced beneath the waves. A dive team filming a World War II documentary off the coast of Florida accidentally discovered an object that didn't fit with anything from that era. What they found was a 20-foot-long section of the Challenger space shuttle, preserved under layers of sand and seawater. This was one of the largest and most intact pieces of wreckage ever recovered, and no one was even looking for it. The footage showed unmistakable thermal tiles still clinging to the fuselage, a haunting reminder of a tragedy most assumed was long closed. But what else might still be down there? And why did NASA keep some wreckage locations secret for so long? The discovery forced NASA to make a rare public confirmation, acknowledging the find and saying the debris would be preserved out of respect for the families and the legacy of the crew. But behind the official statements, the incident reignited a question that's lingered since the disaster. How much do we still not know about what really happened to Challenger and why it happened at all? Just recently, attention returned to Krista McAuliffe, the schoolteacher who had captured the hearts of millions. A life-sized bronze statue was unveiled in her home state of New Hampshire, showing her mid-gesture, engaging, smiling, frozen in the hopeful energy she carried into that doomed launch. The statue wasn't just a tribute. It was a signal that her legacy, and the legacy of all 7 astronauts, still matters. Across classrooms and campuses, her story is being taught not as a feel-good moment about civilian spaceflight, but as a sobering lesson in risk, silence, and institutional failure. Then another name returned to the spotlight. William R. Lucas, former director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and a central figure during the Challenger era. Lucas passed away at the age of 102. For years, his name was tied to the booster program, the very one responsible for the failed O-rings. After the disaster, the Rogers Commission pointed to the culture at Marshall under Lucas's leadership as deeply problematic. Engineers were discouraged from raising concerns, dissent was quietly pushed aside, and bad news was often filtered out before reaching top decision-makers. His death didn't just bring obituaries, it reignited debate. Could Lucas have prevented the disaster? Should more accountability have been demanded from those in charge? Some insiders argue that his management style set the tone for a system where safety was too easily overruled by schedule and optics. In his final years, Lucas gave few interviews and never publicly expressed regret over the decisions made before the launch. Meanwhile, the most brutal detail of the entire Challenger story still shocks people when they first hear it. Most assume the astronauts died instantly, engulfed by the fireball in the sky. But that's not what happened. In fact, at least some of the crew were alive, possibly fully conscious, during the shuttle's 2-minute free fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. How do we know this? 3 of the 7 astronauts' personal egress air packs, or PEEPs, were manually activated after the shuttle broke apart. These PEEPs are small emergency devices designed to provide breathable air, not pressurized or life-saving, but a temporary aid if there's smoke or depressurization inside the cabin. Importantly, they're not automatic. They have to be turned on by hand. Even more disturbing, cockpit switches had been moved from their original launch positions. These weren't accidental or caused by the breakup or onboard systems. Someone was still trying to regain control or at least stabilize the descent. The cabin remained mostly intact until it struck the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour, an impact that was unsurvivable. NASA initially kept these details under wraps, releasing them only after intense media and congressional pressure. To this day, the agency avoids definitive statements about exactly how long the crew might have been aware of their situation. It's a deeply uncomfortable truth rarely found in textbooks or memorials, but it highlights just how avoidable the disaster was. If the O-rings had held, if the launch had been delayed, if engineers had been heard, the final moments in that cabin never would have happened. That discomfort is what journalist Adam Higginbotham tapped into with his investigative book, Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. The book goes beyond the technical failure, digging into the psychology and bureaucracy that allowed it to happen. Higginbotham lays out in disturbing detail how NASA's culture had shifted, from Apollo-era caution to Shuttle-era overconfidence. Risk became acceptable, warnings were rebranded as anomalies, and engineers learned that speaking up could cost them their careers. The launch wasn't a tragic fluke. It was the predictable outcome of a system that had stopped listening. Through interviews, archived memos, and new disclosures, the book reveals how close Challenger came to disaster on multiple earlier missions, and how those near misses made NASA more, not less, likely to push forward without fixing core problems. One of the most controversial points Higginbotham revisits is the rumor of political pressure surrounding the launch. At the time, President Reagan was preparing for his State of the Union address, and having a teacher broadcast from space would have been a powerful visual supporting his message of American exceptionalism. No written order has ever been found linking the White House to the launch decision. But several NASA managers believed another delay would reflect badly on the president and chose to push forward despite the cold weather and engineers' warnings. So much of what made Challenger vulnerable wasn't the technology, it was the culture. A culture that valued deadlines over details, labeled dissent as disloyalty, relied more on public trust than engineering discipline, and looked at a record of close calls and decided somehow that things were fine. Designing for disaster, the flawed rocket NASA kept flying. The solid rocket boosters that launched Challenger into the sky were never supposed to be built the way they were, but they were. Segmented, bolted together, and sealed with rubber gaskets called O-rings. This design decision, made for manufacturing convenience and political approval, created one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in aerospace history. The boosters were made in sections so they could be transported by rail from the contractor's plant in Utah. Each segment was joined with a field joint, sealed by 2 rubber O-rings. These rings were supposed to expand when exposed to the heat of ignition, creating an airtight barrier that prevented burning gases from escaping. But early test flights showed this wasn't always happening. As early as 1981, engineers noticed black soot and burn marks near the O-rings, clear evidence that the seals weren't working properly. Multiple missions between 1981 and 1985 revealed erosion, charring, and even partial failure of the primary O-ring. In some cases, only the secondary O-ring, the backup, had kept hot gases from escaping. It was like finding a hairline crack in a dam but deciding not to fix it because the water hadn't broken through yet. So what kind of system looks at multiple seal failures and chooses to keep flying anyway? The answer lies in a dangerous shift called the normalization of deviance. The idea is simple. When something goes wrong repeatedly but doesn't lead to disaster, people start treating it as normal. The shuttle's O-rings were eroding, that was a fact. But because flights kept landing safely, managers assumed the damage was acceptable. The erosion was reframed as a known issue, not a red flag. And that shift, from anomaly to expectation, is where the real danger began. One of the engineers most disturbed by this pattern was Roger Boisjoli, a senior specialist at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters. Boisjoli started raising serious alarms internally as early as 1984 after several missions showed O-ring damage worse than ever before. After a flight in August that year, engineers found soot between the two O-rings in one joint, meaning the primary seal had completely failed. Only the secondary ring had saved the crew. To Boisjoli, this wasn't a minor hiccup. It was a clear sign the next flight could be fatal. He wrote a detailed memo warning that if these joint seal problems weren't fixed, it could mean the loss of human life. That memo circulated inside Morton Thiokol, but didn't lead to action. Boisjoli and his colleague Alan MacDonald kept pushing. They proposed design changes, requested cold weather testing, and even suggested adding a third O-ring for redundancy. Each time the response was the same: not now, too expensive, too time-consuming. We can't delay the next flight. Meanwhile, NASA's internal culture wasn't set up to handle this kind of pushback. Managers were under enormous pressure to meet launch schedules promised to Congress, the military, and international partners. Every successful flight without a catastrophic failure reinforced the illusion that the system was safe enough. But that illusion came at a terrible cost. Engineers across NASA and its contractors generated more and more evidence showing the O-rings were degrading, especially in cold weather. A disturbing trend emerged. The colder the launch day, the more damage the O-rings suffered. But instead of grounding the shuttles or demanding redesigns, management chose to interpret this data the opposite way. They treated past survival as proof of durability. The logic, if you can call it that, was, if the O-rings failed before but didn't cause an explosion, then maybe they can keep failing without consequences. In private meetings, engineers were horrified. One called the Shuttle system a ticking time bomb. Another called the seal design a catastrophe waiting to happen. Internal documents warned of the risk of blow-by, hot gases escaping past both O-rings and igniting fuel. These weren't vague fears. They were mathematically modeled, supported by flight data, and delivered in writing, but still, nothing changed. Why? Why would some of the brightest minds in science and engineering allow a known flaw to persist? Because somewhere along the line, the schedule became more important than safety. The shuttle program had promised 24 flights a year. Crews were trained and ready. Satellites were scheduled. School children were waiting to watch a teacher float in space. And no one in upper management wanted to be the person responsible for another delay. NASA had boxed itself in. By the mid-1980s, each shuttle mission carried a long list of obligations to international partners, commercial clients, military stakeholders, and the public. Delays weren't just inconvenient, they were politically and financially embarrassing. So when Morton Thiokol engineers started warning about the O-rings, their concerns were weighed not only against safety, but optics. Managers weren't asking, "Is this safe?" They were asking, "Can we justify going ahead?" Boisjoli and MacDonald pushed as hard as they could. They spoke up at meetings. They risked their reputations. Every time they tried, they were pressured to back off, to be team players, to trust the process. In the lead-up to Challenger's final launch, the pressure reached a breaking point. By then, launches had become routine. Challenger had flown 9 times before. Its 10th mission, STS-51L, was expected to be just another media-friendly success. But as engineers looked at the forecast and saw a cold front moving over Cape Canaveral, concern turned into fear. On the night before launch, Boisjoli and other Thiokol engineers strongly urged NASA to delay the launch. They warned that O-rings had never been tested in such cold temperatures. They feared the rubber would harden, lose flexibility, and fail to seal. They showed charts, past flight data, erosion trends, everything they had. At first, their company supported them, but when NASA pushed back, asking for proof that cold would cause failure, Thiokol management folded. In a now infamous moment, management told the engineers to put on their management hats. And just like that, the objection was withdrawn. Challenger launched the next morning. 73 seconds later, it was over. What really happened in those 73 seconds? At liftoff, everything seemed normal. The countdown had gone smoothly, the engines fired, and Challenger began its ascent on a massive pillar of fire and smoke. The crowd on the ground, including the astronauts' families, cheered as the shuttle climbed higher and higher. But the disaster had already begun. Just 1 second after liftoff, a puff of gray smoke appeared near the lower joint of the right solid rocket booster. Cameras caught it, though it was subtle and easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. That puff wasn't ordinary smoke. It was the first sign that the O-ring seal had failed. The rubber O-rings were supposed to expand with the heat of ignition and seal the booster joints airtight, preventing any hot gases from leaking out. But the cold temperature made the O-rings stiff, too stiff to flex quickly enough when the boosters ignited. That initial puff was actually hot gas escaping through a small gap in the joint between two booster segments. It wasn't supposed to be there. Incredibly, the shuttle kept flying after that. A small piece of charred insulation or debris inside the booster got wedged in the gap, temporarily blocking the leak. This temporary sealing by debris was pure luck. A burning rocket was being held together by a scrap of trash. Challenger continued to rise, burning fuel furiously. Around 45 seconds into the flight, it passed through max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure where speed and air density put the most stress on the vehicle. Again, everything seemed normal. Telemetry data flowed and the crew remained calm. From the ground, it looked like a perfect launch, but at 64 seconds, the temporary plug failed. The debris blocking the leak blew out under pressure. A bright orange flame appeared near the lower strut connecting the right booster to the huge external fuel tank. This flame wasn't just visible, it was deadly. It burned sideways, aimed directly at the hydrogen tank. Inside the external tank were liquid hydrogen and oxygen, stored under high pressure and extremely cold temperatures. The flame cut through the thin aluminum skin of the tank like a blowtorch. Within seconds, it penetrated the structure. The internal pressure began to destabilize. At 72 seconds, the flame was clearly visible on multiple video feeds. At 73 seconds, it was over. But there was no single dramatic explosion. Instead, the external fuel tank ruptured under pressure. Its supercooled hydrogen and oxygen mixed violently and ignited. This caused a massive, uncontrolled release of energy. The shuttle's main structure couldn't handle the forces. The orbiter broke apart mid-air. Pieces separated instantly. The nose cone, crew cabin, and tail section all detached and tumbled along separate paths. The two solid rocket boosters, still burning fuel at full power, continued flying on erratic, uncontrolled trajectories, no longer attached to anything. One of them even performed a full cartwheel. From the ground, it looked like one big explosion, a flash, a giant smoke plume, and chaos. In reality, the breakup took several seconds, and the fireball wasn't the shuttle itself, but the result of leaking fuel igniting in the atmosphere. The crew cabin, located at the front of the orbiter, remained mostly intact as it was thrown out of the cloud. It began a long, terrifying fall lasting about 2.5 minutes toward the Atlantic Ocean. Back on the ground, silence filled mission control. The Capcom, the capsule communicator who talks to the crew, had just instructed them to throttle up. Commander Dick Scobie calmly replied, "Roger, go at throttle up." Those were the last words anyone heard from Challenger. Seconds later, all data feeds went dead. The shuttle's systems stopped transmitting. Inside NASA, the realization spread fast, even before the public knew what they were watching. A flight controller's voice finally broke the silence. "Flight, we have a major malfunction." Meanwhile, the rocket boosters were still flying, uncontrolled, dangerous, and fully active. Ground safety officers acted fast. They triggered the range safety destruct systems, built-in explosives designed to destroy wayward rockets to prevent damage or casualties. The boosters were blown up high in the sky, far from populated areas. It would take investigators weeks to piece together exactly what went wrong. But early on, engineers knew the answer: the O-rings, the cold, the joint design, the ignored warnings. The media called it an explosion, but engineers objected. There was no detonation like a bomb. No single ignition destroyed Challenger. What happened was mechanical and chemical, and deeply preventable. A flawed seal leaked, a flame breached a fuel tank, and the whole structure collapsed under the weight of bad decisions and false confidence. They might have lived. The grim truth about the crew cabin. When Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, the shuttle fragmented, but the crew cabin did not. Unlike the rest of the shuttle, which broke apart almost instantly, the forward crew compartment stayed mostly intact. It separated as a single structure, continuing its upward motion for a few more seconds before beginning an uncontrolled descent from about 65,000 feet. Inside that cabin were 7 astronauts. For years, most people assumed they died instantly when the shuttle exploded. That belief isn't entirely accurate. In fact, some of them were likely alive during the descent. How do we know? Emergency air packs, called PEAPs, were found to have been manually activated. PEAPs are small, portable devices that provide breathable air for short periods in case of smoke or loss of ventilation. They aren't pressurized and don't offer full protection in a vacuum, but they do show that someone was aware enough to reach for them. These packs don't turn on automatically. They have to be switched on by hand. 3 of the 7 PEAPs were clearly used. This was confirmed during the official Rogers Commission investigation. Investigators also found that pilot Mike Smith made contact with cockpit controls after the breakup. Several switches in the cockpit had been moved from their standard launch positions. These switches were located in places that could only be accessed manually, not affected by the shock of breakup or onboard automation. In other words, someone, likely Smith, was trying to do something during the fall. The exact purpose of those switch movements is still debated. Some think they were reflexive. Others believe they may have been attempts to stabilize or prepare the cabin. Either way, it tells us something very important. At least one astronaut was conscious after the shuttle broke apart. The descent lasted just over 2 minutes, about 120 seconds, with no engines, no guidance, and no way to communicate. The crew had no parachutes, no emergency ejection, no cabin separation system. There was no power source, lighting failed, and radio contact was lost. The cabin followed a high arc, slowly rising before falling toward the ocean. It tumbled and twisted during the fall, but the internal structure stayed intact. During this time, cabin pressure probably dropped. A sudden loss of pressure at that altitude would cause hypoxia, a lack of oxygen, which might have caused the astronauts to lose consciousness before impact. But since the cabin didn't break apart mid-air, there's a chance that some pressure remained, enough for a few of them to be aware during the descent. The official cause of death for all 7 astronauts was the ocean impact, not the initial breakup. The cabin struck the water at over 200 miles per hour. There was no way to survive that. The cabin disintegrated on impact. What investigators found afterward was deeply distressing, but it also changed the way future spacecraft were designed. The aftermath and lessons learned. After the disaster, the investigation and public outrage forced NASA to confront hard truths. The Rogers Commission laid bare the technical failures, but more importantly, it exposed a broken culture, a system where safety warnings were ignored, where engineers were silenced, and where political and schedule pressures ruled the day. The fallout was huge. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. New safety measures were introduced, design changes made, and oversight improved. NASA's approach to risk was forever changed, though the wounds ran deep. One of the lasting impacts was a renewed respect for dissenting voices. Engineers who once feared speaking up found more support. Procedures were rewritten to prioritize safety over schedule. But the question remained, Could it happen again? The Challenger disaster is a powerful reminder of what happens when we prioritize deadlines and appearances over facts and caution. It's about the human cost of organizational failures. Journalist Adam Higginbotham's investigative book, Challenger, A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space, captures this perfectly. It tells the story not just of engineering flaws, but of a culture that slowly normalized risk until disaster became inevitable. It also reminds us of the real heroes, the astronauts who boarded the shuttle knowing the dangers. Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher, inspired millions by bringing space closer to everyday people. Her legacy, along with that of the other 6 crew members, is a call to remember that behind every mission are lives, fragile, precious, and irreplaceable. The discovery of Challenger's wreckage decades later, the memorials and ongoing investigations show that this tragedy still resonates. We continue to learn from it, to honor those lost, and to push for a safer future in space exploration. So, what's the takeaway? Technology will always have risks, but ignoring warnings and silencing concerns only multiplies them. True progress requires listening, really listening, to every voice and never losing sight of what's most important: human life. Thanks for watching. If you found this video eye-opening, hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories. Click on the next video for more fascinating content.